Good morning. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak on Citizen Television. Thank you for staying with us. We are looking at the budget policy statement and the first and for President William Ruto and the Kenya Kwanza administration. And let's look at the allocations per sector in the proposals 2023-24. Agriculture, in terms of value addition, talking about that, President William Ruto, when he was the deputy president and launched his manifesto in June last year, said value addition will have a key place in his administration. It's among the key pillars in the budget policy statement. But this has declined from the previous allocation of 68.9 billion Kenya shillings to 67.7 billion Kenya shillings. This is said to be the backbone of the economy, but there seems to be a disconnect in terms of the funding gaps, and we'll be talking about that and how it poses problems when it comes to job creation. The allocations per sector, this is on the energy, infrastructure and information communication technology allocated 98.2 billion Kenya shillings as per the proposals as contained in the budget policy statement. Also taking a look at health, 148.2 billion Kenya shillings as per the budget policy statement, BPS, that was made public. The education sector is set to gobble up 580.5 billion Kenya shillings, this coming to effect because of the rolling out of the competence-based curriculum, the employment of 30,000 teachers to support the junior secondary school learners who will be reporting to school next week on Monday. And this is the plan by the Teacher Service Commission in absorbing the 30,000 teachers. They are, however, set to appear before the National Assembly Education Committee that is chaired by Julius Melly, the itinerant MP, to shed more light on the methodology as to how they will be absorbing the teachers and the continuity plan thereafter going forward, with regards to also the Parliamentary Budget Office, which says that the Kenya Kwanza administration, by the end of the 5 years, it will be in power until August 2027, will need more than 630 billion Kenya shillings to actualize its education pledge. And taking a look at the governance, justice and order, here comes the judiciary, how the government is run, and the administration of justice, 234 in total, 0.7 billion Kenya shillings. And moving away from the allocations and taking a look at the other specifications, national security, one more, 220.7 billion Kenya shillings as per the plan by President William Ruto, this including the interior and, of course, the country's defense with regards to boosting its security and the armament. Let's take a look at the country's debt load. In the financial year 2023-2024, the deficit, according to the budget policy statement, will be 695 billion Kenya shillings. That is the hole that the government will be fixing. And to fix that, the government will borrow 496.6 billion Kenya shillings from domestic, and that is internal. And external, it will borrow 198 billion Kenya shillings. The difference between the budget deficit in the 2023-24, according to the budget policy statement, and the current financial year 2023 rather, is 154 billion Kenya shillings. The last financial year, which is set to end in June, had 849 billion. Therefore, the difference is 154 billion Kenya shillings for the first budget of President William Ruto's administration. Let's take a look at the debt, which has been on the increase, and this in the year 2020, 6.69 trillion Kenya shillings. In 2021, 7.69 trillion Kenya shillings, and in 2022, we are at 8.59 trillion Kenya shillings, and that is what President William Ruto has said his government will be prioritizing, ending the begging bowl culture. But to what effect? Many economists do not agree with that. By October, the government says it will reduce that from 67.7 October in 2022, with the year by the year 2026, in 4.5 years' time. They say that will be down the budget in terms of the ratio, 51%, according to the budget policy statement as contained in the presentation by the National Treasury. I now hand you over to my colleague, Safina Chieng.
All right, great numbers there. Thank you, Ayub, for breaking that down for us. And of course, just before we look at the priority areas for the Kenya Kwanza administration, I'm excited, just looking at the drop in terms of the deficit, a difference of 154 billion shillings this time around, because they are saying that the budget deficit this time around is 695 billion compared to 849 billion that was there in the financial year 2022-2023. Honorable Kero, does this paint some positive picture for you, or what?
our budget deficit has averaged about 9% for the last 10 years of the previous administration. But if you look at every budget session, the pledge to bring it down to 4%, below 5%, has always been there, and they have not succeeded. And the reason is because the revenue targets are always very ambitious, and if you don't achieve those revenue targets, but you overshoot on your expenditure, then the deficit goes back to 7, 8, 9%. The thing of concern to me is that in this statement, budget policy statement, if you look at it, our debts are going to increase. Our debts are going to increase to 12.4 trillion by 2027. By the time this administration has done its 5 years, it says the figure will be 12.4 trillion. The government will have borrowed 3.9 trillion in the next 5 years, this government. This is their own information in the document. And this flies in the face of the pledge to try and reduce debt. When you look at this document, there's no intention to reduce debt. For the simple reason that even despite having very, very ambitious revenue targets, the expenditure is huge. So that, as I mentioned earlier, planning to spend 5 trillion, expenditure, above 5 trillion by 2027. And the reason why I'm worried is that the figure will even go more than that, the 12 trillion. And the reason is very simple. They have based these estimates on a very conservative budget deficit because they hope to expand the revenue base. They want to leverage on IT, and they want to go into all those informal sector and all those things, and VAT, and all those things. But what if they don't achieve those targets then of the revenue? So once you set your target for expenditure, you would want to spend the money. If you don't have it, then you'll be forced to borrow. And this is my concern. For example, this financial year, ending June, the target for the revenue is 2 trillion, 2.07. And KRA is already behind. The figures published for November, for the first 5 months, they're behind by 30 billion. If they fall behind today, they cannot raise 2 trillion. And you're saying in the next 4 years, by end of 2027, by June 2027, you want revenue to be double, minimum 4 trillion. And that's going to be a tall order. And given the background of the economy is still in bad shape. We will sit here and talk about the economy because we talk about Nairobi and the factories and the people earning income, but so forth. But I think when you look at the economy, in reality, our economy is still very bad. People have no jobs. People's incomes are down. There's huge unemployment. The cost of living is still going up. It's not going down. So to try and create a situation where my take has always been that this government should have focused on turning around the economy first. Before thinking of doubling the tax, from Kenyans. And the president has given an example of what Kibaki has done. Kibaki did not start with the tax. Kibaki grew the economy from 200 and, the revenues from 200 billion to above 700 billion. And so the tax grew consistent with that. The tax revenues grew from 220 billion to 800 billion because they were consistent with the growth of the economy. So I think you need to really turn around the economy. And the economy is tricky. When you say the economy has grown, quite often the figures we get from Treasury is what I call the elitist part of the economy. Because like last year, you are told, and it's in this document, that the economy grew by 7.5%. If you walk to Kenyans and tell them, really, the economy grew last year, the former president was on record in the campaigns that the economy is in bad shape. This government, when they were campaigning, that was the platform on which they came in, that the economy is really bad. It's collapsed.
So you're saying the impact of that growth is
yes,
not felt
it's not going to be, it's not normally felt down.
So when you say...
You see the figures, let me explain. The figures that you see of the growth comes from those sectors that do not necessarily impact on the majority of Kenyans. They come from the banking sector, they come from ICT sector, the growth in Safaricom. They look at this infrastructure, like when you pump in billions into expressway and SGR, those are the things which create all those figures. But majority, 80% of the Kenyans are in agriculture. You look at whether that sector grew, and you find the sector's growth is more or less stagnant during that period. So the figures of growth that the government always shows do not necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. This is why this government came on that pledge to turn around the economy, because they said the economy has collapsed. But their figures, when you read, tells you that our economy is done 6.5 last year, the previous year 7.5, and this year we want to do another, 6.3 or something. So I think we have to be rational in the utilization of these figures, because the reality is down there, people don't see that impact of growth that you keep.
And will this strategy work? The Kenya Kwanza government, we all know, one of the biggest winners in this budget are the farmers. Access to cheap fertilizer as a state-funded subsidy program, the one that was launched. There's also the plan to, boost small business owners through state loans. We all know the Hustler Fund that every Kenyan can now access. Will that progressively give us some form of results, Mheshimiwa?
Well, I would think it depends if they implement it. If they implement it effectively, it will. You see, I agree with what Ayub said earlier. The focus of this government's manifesto, which is in the budget policy statement, is value addition in agriculture. Agriculture seems to be the main thing, really, that they want to turn around this economy based on the agriculture. The cost of living will reduce based on agriculture. Everything is premised on the success of agriculture. And agriculture, the subsidy for the fertilizer is one thing, but when you look at reports by experts, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of getting the cost of production cheaper, because fuel is a major expense. You have to deal with the cost of energy. You have to deal with the cost of transportation and so forth. You have to deal with tax. It's a major issue, by the way. The reason why all these things are expensive is because of tax. Everything here has got one form or the other of tax on it.
Okay.
So I think they need to look at it, in a very holistic manner, not just on fertilizer. Every government, including the previous one, when they came in, they had focused on giving subsidies on fertilizers. But that did not always turn around the situation on the cost of food. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. John Kitui, because the president has said to address the cost of living, our priority should be agriculture, then that will be the bottom line. That will be the holding glue together to address the cost of living crisis in the country. Because at the moment we're importing basic commodities like eggs, yet they can be available here. Some foodstuff or commodities we are importing can be, of course, produced here in Kenya. How then do we turn around this economy to be an export-oriented economy? Because that will be a huge boost in terms of job creation in the agriculture sector.
Thanks, Ayub. So I think as Honorable Bilkero says, really the rubber meets the tarmac at implementation level. And if we implement some of these policy statements or political statements that the government makes, we would be at a much, much better place. Follow the money. So when you look at the budget statement, we are allocating 67.7 billion to agriculture, which is a lesser allocation compared to last year, which was even a lesser allocation to previous years, which was actually hidden within rural development and environment and other things as well. So as a nation, we've consistently underinvested in agriculture, and therefore we cannot be able to achieve even just the extension services to farmers, to the smallholder farmers, actually. When you talk about Kenya, agriculture is the backbone of this country. The people who feed this nation is 75% of our smallholder farmers. 75% of our food comes from the smallholder farmers. We are underinvesting into that. Now, when you look at even the allocation to the Ministry of Agriculture, the bulk of it will go into running to the expenditures of the ministry, as opposed to actual services to farmers themselves. But also the bulk of the investments we've done in agriculture, for example, have gone towards more of the cash crops as well, the flowers and everything else. So the shift away from even just the food-based food production in agriculture in a time when we are facing a drought and hunger crisis and the food prices are going up and there is no access to eggs and maize and everything else, a lot of our agriculture has now shifted towards more of the commercial agriculture. But it's because of the elusive pursuit of GDP growth. And I think for me, I look forward to a day where, as a government, we'll be advised by the IMFs and the World Bank to really develop a budget that focuses on Human Development Index. Because the pursuit of GDP growth by budget statement is in itself, I think, misdirecting. It sends us on the wrong path. we're pursuing growth for the sake of growth and growth at all costs. So we can just, if the government borrows and puts it into infrastructure development, that will be captured as growth. When it's actually a meaningless growth, it does not create jobs, it does not put money in people's pocket as the government wants to do. It does not make sure that the smallholder farmer who has grown their food and food sovereignty and food security produces food in a much more productive way. But it's just because we are pursuing growth by all means. And therefore, the government's priority, therefore, is to put money where it can easily achieve growth, regardless of if that growth is meaningless in the streets. If we approached our budget policy statement from a human development index, we would completely make different choices in terms of allocation.
That is a focus on the value of the shilling in the Kenyan pocket.
Exactly.
And increasing the disposable income.
Exactly. And reducing just the misery. It's a year with the ongoing drought. I'm sure the government would have prioritized even just how do we make sure that people who are in the arid and semi-arid lands are not dying from hunger? How do we make sure that we are investing in agriculture in a way that supports the communities that have practiced pastoralism over the past so many years to start rethinking agricultural production, for example, because the population has grown, the land is smaller to be able to support the pastoralism, for example. How do we tap the water that has been found in the northeastern parts of this country? Would make completely different choices in the allocation to the Minister of Agriculture to try to get the 80% of Kenya that is considered arid and semi-arid land productive from an agricultural perspective, bring them into the agricultural economy in a much more progressive way.
All right.
So I think for me, it's focusing on the Human Development Index would be a better true north to anchor our budget policy statements.
Okay, thank you. And because manufacturing is also very key, and interestingly, there's only one paragraph that speaks about manufacturing in the entire budget policy statement. I wonder how of a priority is this to the Kenya Kwanza administration. But here is Trade CS Moses Kuria, who spoke about manufacturing at length and how it pains him. He spoke in Wamwangi village in Gatundu South constituency in the county of Kiambu during the burial of his elder sister, Pauline Nyokafi Kuria.
We have another cancer, the cancer of poverty. And that cancer of poverty is caused by a virus called lack of production that we've seen over the years. We have dropped the ball in terms of development. Our manufacturing has dropped. Our export is nothing to talk about. We don't attract investment anymore. When we talk about debt, and we talk about interest rates, we talk about exchange rates, and all those things, balancing the budget, that is not a sickness. That is a symptom. The actual cancer, the actual sickness, at the core of the poverty that we have is that we don't produce anymore. We don't manufacture, we don't export, and the hustlers have been cut off from that chain of export, of investment, of manufacturing. It was left to some few people, and we continued. When we look at GDP, we see 7%, and we cheated ourselves that that is production, and the economy is growing.
All right. You've had it there, Mheshimiwa Bilo Kero. I mean, is that it?
Well,
we don't produce anymore. That is
yeah.
the cause of poverty in our country. That's according to the trade seers. Do you think that is the
No,
problem?
he's right. If you look at our exports, it's now about a third of the imports. Frankly, I mean, we are not. There's no growth. But the reason is very simple. One is what he has mentioned: lack of priorities, and this you see even in the allocations. You have mentioned agriculture went down from 68 to 67. If food security was a priority, why would you reduce allocations to agriculture from 68 last year to 67 and increase allocation to national security by 50 billion? Why would, allocation to security alone, national security is over 220 billion. Compare that to, if this national security was our priority, then you can understand. But if food security you say is your priority, it's been the big four, it's been everything. You give it 68, 67, and you give national security 220 billion, and that's not enough for public administration. 370 billion. When you add that to governance and law and those ones, 234 billion. I mean, those, you can see the priorities of the government is in administration, in national security, in those institutions of governance. That's where the government is sending 800 billion. And that is why we are in that situation. Number two is the policies on manufacturing and production that is killing us. We've lost that competitiveness in this region, and we have said this many, many times. And the same minister has a singular opportunity to address all those policies, which are making it very difficult for manufacturers to invest in you know, and to bring more investments and to bring more people to manufacture in this country because of the government policies. One of those policies that has discouraged people and moved away many industries from this country to Egypt, to Uganda, to other countries is taxes. You know, when you are in business, at the end of the day, you need a return on your profit, on your investment. Okay. But we know the high level of taxes, and I've given this example in different documents I've published in this. For example, our corporate taxes for companies is among the highest in Africa. You know, and although the government says we don't pay taxes, we still, on average, have the highest tax revenue to GDP ratio in Africa. That's, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 17%. The average in most countries is 11, 12% in Uganda, Tanzania, even in Egypt, and many other countries. So we're actually paying a lot of tax, and these things discourage investors. But there are many other policies that make it very difficult for people to pull investments, to encourage manufacturers to come here. They go to other countries where the business environment is better, the cost of production is cheaper, the cost of energy here is extremely high. Uhuru came into power saying, I'm going to reduce the cost of energy. He started SGR, he says, I'm going to reduce the cost of freight. Nothing has happened, they've all gone up. Okay. So that lack of competitiveness is what has made, you know, exports to collapse and the cost of production to become very high. So it's very difficult for you to think of investing in a farm in Kenya to produce wheat or maize or anything. It would be cheaper to do it in any of the other countries because the cost of energy would be cheaper, the cost of fuel would be cheaper, everything else would be the same, and the tax environment, many other things that have more tax. So they have an opportunity to address all those policy issues to make it easier for people to come and invest here.
Okay. Dr. John Kitui, when he talks about foreign direct investment, that is the CS Moses Kuria, and there has been the decry by multinationals who are getting out of Kenya and investing in places like Ethiopia and in Rwanda. Is it because of the predictable and fairer taxation over there? And when it comes to cost of production, why not geothermal since it's efficient and cheaper?
So on the production element, I think the cost of production in Kenya has always been very high. And I think as Honorable Bill Kero says, I think one of the things that the government has to do is just make sure that the cost of doing business in Kenya is cheaper. I don't think for me it's taxation per se. I think we look at countries like Rwanda where the capital gains tax is about 30%. Kenya, we have 15%. Tanzania, Uganda, I think is about 10%. But we have foreign direct investment still going to Rwanda. Why? It's because the cost of doing business in Rwanda is much more better and affordable. But also it's very, very predictable. In Kenya, partly I think the other frustration for me or disappointment in the budget policy statement was there was no talk about corruption a lot, than saying that we are going to tackle the weaponized use of fighting corruption as a political tool. But I think for me, corruption is one of those elements that makes the cost of doing business in the country very, very huge. People would come and do business here if they knew they can easily set up, make their profits, and pay taxes. So taxation is not a good reason for multinationals or for foreign direct investment not to come. I think it will still come because everyone acknowledges we have to pay tax. I think actually as Kenyans, people who make wealth in this country do not pay a lot of taxation. Many multinational companies, they are registered in tax havens. We have a lot of illicit financial flows that actually I think the government and Kenya Revenue Authority should be trying to plug. There's a lot of exemptions and incentives we give by still not attracting the foreign direct investment. So we have to deal with the cost of doing business, which I think Honorable Moses Kuria has the capacity to address. So I think for me, that's one of the things we have to deal with. And one of those ways is we have to really have a very good strategy to deal with corruption. Otherwise, it strains credibility, especially for this government. Especially once they came to power, we see that we lost almost 30 billion that was in courts and on corruption, on people who are very, very well connected to the current administrative. So it really casts aspersion on this government's seriousness to deal with corruption, and that will have a huge effect on foreign direct investments as opposed to things like taxation. So I think for me is yes, let's make as a country, I think the government and Moses Kuria has a huge opportunity to make the cost of doing business much easier.
And given that you talk about corruption, the president passionately talked about Galana Kulalo project, and he personally visited there in terms of its reviving, saying that this will be rebooted for food production in the country. But you look at its collapse, and the company that was contracted to do that job literally pulled out because of what it said were frustrations by government officials asking for kickbacks, the 10% that is the norm in caveat. And that is the first time he said that the ambassador of Israel, before he requested his government to recall him back to Tel Aviv during the tenure of the former prime minister, now prime minister again, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that there is no business to business between an Israeli company that has ever failed. And this is the first one, therefore, frustration society from government officials. And then when is the time that the administration understands the cost of corruption, which is corroding? And also in terms of the taxing, is it an under-collection problem, or putting into an efficient use the revenues that are collected?
Good question. So again, I think it actually, the example you give on the Galana Kulalu is a very good example of why corruption is the key explainer of why the foreign direct investment is going down in this country. It increases the cost of production for many people who would like to invest in this country. So I think for me, I think the Honorable Moses Kuria's frustration should really be directed at the corruption that makes it very, very difficult for people who want to do business in this country to do business. Now, again, I think another thing about Galana Kulalu, I think it's not the responsibility of government to do business. All governments that try to do business do it badly. Mm-hmm. You cannot do business as a government to increase GDP. That is the role of the private sector. Where the government comes in is to create an enabling environment for the private sector to do business. And I think for me, the government should really focus on that. They should try to get out of business themselves and create an enabling environment for private sector to do business. Galana Kulalu, I think many analysts already saw it failing way, way before even it started. Just the model itself as well, going in and creating hundreds and hundreds of acres of just plain land of a monoculture. You cannot sustainably produce food that way. I think there are other better strategies of food production in this country, and we can go into the agricultural policy and everything else. But I think the primary reason why Galana Kulalu failed was partly corruption, but also the government trying to do the things that actually private sector can do much better, as opposed to creating an enabling environment for private sector.
And now we're talking, sorry. And now
I just wanted to clarify one. The capital gains, Dr. Ari talked about a lot, but it's not a very significant source of revenue in this country. I mean, if you look at last year, the total amount KRA collected on capital gains is about 16 billion. Even if that was at 5%, even if you make it 15%, you're talking of 40 billion at most. And the reason why it's not very encouraged is because if you up the capital gains tax, then you make the cost of mortgages, the cost of houses more expensive. It's another thing that the government has been trying to, you want the cost of housing to be affordable and so forth. So if you charge more, the people will charge more again up there. They'll just pass on the cost to the home buyers, and so the cost of property again becomes more expensive. But it's not a major. So they have increased now to 15%, but it's not. That's why in many countries, in addition, when you attract people to invest into housing, there are many other services that benefit in the economy, the building materials, the labor, the employment. It creates a lot of, so to encourage that generally, the capital gains is generally low, but the idea is also to make, not to increase the cost of housing, because they tend to pass that down. But I think the issue you mentioned, and which Dr. Ari mentioned, the issue of corruption is a major issue, because one would have thought that one of the focus of this government would be how to reduce the leakages from revenue leakages in corruption. On the spending side, the government has said we are spending 700, we are losing 700 billion or 200 billion, 2 billion per day. It comes to about 600-700 billion. That would be a lot of money to save, and there isn't a lot of discussion on that. And if we continue losing money, then it makes, it doesn't make sense that you want to push Mambogo to pay money, to pay taxes. And here there are people who are wasting money. What you see today in Mombasa, people staying there and refusing to attend classes, or, members of parliament.
And the allowances you can
yes,
imagine.
So I think the focus should be on those measures to try and reduce wastage in government. Even more than corruption, wastage is the single largest loss of money in government. Inefficiencies, duplication, wastages is very common in government, and I think that they can save a lot of money there.
Okay.
And now we are talking about value addition very quickly before we shift into other matters. I wonder what missed potential we are looking at in terms of value addition, and how come it took us so long before we can benefit from this? I mean, what is it that probably we don't have? Is it that we don't have the expertise? Is it that we don't have, you know, the right people to do it, or what is it? Let's explore that area, Mheshimiwa. Let's
no, we have the expertise. You know, value addition is more of the businessmen, you know, giving them that environment in terms of policy, in terms of whatever, so that they can invest in more manufacturing and value. For example, in our coffee, there's no reason why 50 years after independence we are still sending, you know, our coffee beans out instead of value addition and sending a branded, you know, a coffee that would be sold all over. You know, the same thing with the tea, the same thing with any of all of our products. But I think the focus has been to try and encourage businessmen and investors to go into that, you know, value addition in coffee, in tea, in horticulture, in all of our products, so that whatever we sell, the farmers benefit. Because you sell a kilogram of coffee here at a price which is probably a tenth of what it will fetch eventually when the final product hits the market in Europe or in the US. And so I think they have, in the past, created export processing zones to try and encourage people to go into manufacturing, so that some of those things could be done there. And I know, for example, things like nuts. In the last few years, you go to EPZs, you'll find there's a lot of effort to try and value add, you know, macadamia nuts and many of the nuts that we produce, cashew nuts and so forth. But still, I think value addition in agricultural products in this country, what the government needs to do really is to incentivize businessmen. I know Dr. Hari doesn't like incentivizing because he says you are making the rich richer, but that is the only way you can encourage people to invest into that area. The government used to have a policy, anywhere in the world, by the way, when you are into manufacturing or into any investment, they give you investment deduction allowances, many other types of allowances to try and encourage you to put money into manufacturing, but recoup that cost before you start paying taxes on it. This is one way many countries encourage people to come and over the last few years, because of the pressure of tax, government has been reducing all those incentives. It's one of the reasons why you find people moving into other countries, because when I invest $1 billion into this country through manufacturing equipment and plant and so forth, but I cannot recoup that in the next 2 or 3 years. It will take me probably 10 years because of the way that those allowances have been reduced by the government. So I will go to the next country and still export those things into this country when they're the finished goods. But I think I like the focus. I think the government needs to specifically sit on, you know, go into details and encourage people to go into, and by creating incentives, by giving, reviewing the policies that would affect, you know, discourage people from value addition and so forth. They can do it. Countries that don't have capacity are doing it. Our tea goes to Dubai. Dubai is one of the largest exporters of tea in the world today because they provide everything. You go to Jebel Ali, you cannot believe it. They provide everything so that if you want to add value addition, you brand your tea and you package it and send it all over the world, and they're not producing.
Which ought to have happened here.
Which ought to
because
have
they're not
happened,
the producers.
Which ought to have happened here, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Kitui, talking about the austerity drive by the government and following the directive by the National Treasury, which plans to cut spending by about 300 billion Kenya shillings in the current financial year, which is set, the other one is set to start on July the 1st, an indication of deeper austerity measures by the government. And what does this then portend for the market? Because if the government isn't spending, the consequences will be on the hoteliers. You look at the domestic tourism sector. I mean, doesn't this also bear consequences?
Thanks. A very, very good question. My response will be a bit controversial, but I don't think for me the government should spend to keep business afloat. It's not the purpose of government to spend to keep GDP up. And I think for me, as Honorable Billy accuses me of not liking incentives, I think incentives, if well designed, can be very, very good. And exemptions, they can be very, very good. But I think in this country, exemptions and incentives are misused. They are wealth transfer from a few low-income earners to the rich income earners. In 2019, let me give an example. When NCBA acquired NIC, Kenya Revenue Authority gave them an exemption from paying tax of 350 million Kenya shillings. I think that there's no way you can say that's an incentive that helps even the economy grow.
Exemption. Those are exemptions.
Those are exemptions.
Not incentives.
Okay, yes. But anyway, this country loses a lot of income and revenue through incentives that are not rationalized. So I think for me, yes, there's a place for incentives, and I think probably well targeted, especially for example to cooperatives. Value addition can add value. On the austerity, I think the big question again, it comes back to implementation. I think we've talked a lot about the implementation. The intent, I think, is always there. You can see the good intent on cutting back 300 billion in expenditure in this year's budget. So those austerity intentions are very good. The question has always been about the feasibility in the first place. So arbitrary cuts of transport and everything else doesn't make sense. Can we target non-priority expenditure instead of just saying, oh, no more travels, no more meetings? The government will still have to have meetings and it will still have to have travel and everything else. It's just that they need to be rationalized as well. So I think the feasibility of also the cuts did not lend it very, very easy for effective implementation. And even where it would make sense to implement them, the implementation also is a big, big challenge. So for example, instead of members of parliament going to Mombasa and then refusing to attend the induction meetings for a whole week, so they basically we're paying them, as taxpayers, we're paying for their holiday there. Why didn't we take them to the Kenya School of Government? So they can protest and refuse to attend classes, but we know that we have this infrastructure that we've paid for as taxpayers. They can still protest and go back home, and we are not footing their bill while they are remaining in the cost as well. Huge delegations we send outside the country, whether it was at the COP, for example, in other meetings. So there is a lot of expenses that you look at and you think, no way. I think here, this would be a very, very low-hanging fruits to cut, to cut expenditure. And I think those austerity measures prudently should have been extended to the next financial year as well, in terms of the ceiling that the Treasury is giving to the parent ministries, so that, and I think what Bill Kero says, it's wastage really. I think for me it's budgeted corruption. So you basically just budget that as a ministry, we will have 10 workshops in Mombasa, and each of them will attract these per diems and everything else. So we are already budgeting in the next year's corruption itself, or diversion of taxes to us as individuals through a lot of unnecessary meetings and workshops in high-end hotels in Mombasa and everywhere else. So I think for me, it's yes, we need to really, the austerity measures have to be continue, but they have to be more prudent, they have to be very well informed. We should not be cutting on social spending, where the government's responsibility should be at. And yeah, again, I think Bill Kero mentioned as well, insecurity. Why are we spending 220 billion Kenya shillings? As someone has joked, you'd think Kenya is the one at war in Ukraine. Like we're spending so much money as if we are at war, when actually we are in the midst of a drought. I would expect that actually this is the year we allocate 220 billion to agriculture, because we have to say this drought, we have to deal with it, move to irrigation agriculture. We have to end food insecurity by 2025, and this is the year that we reduce the budget allocation to the security so that we can invest in actually producing food in country. I wanted to comment on the value addition a bit as well. And I think in the agriculture sector, why farmers, our smallholder farmers remain poor is because of lack of investment in value addition. And I think this is where, Bill Kero, the incentives to businesses who work with farmers would make sense, but also to the farmer organizations and cooperatives themselves. What happened to the cooperative movement? Why should farmers in Laikipia grow tomatoes and then brokers go there and buy at very, very low prices because they are going to perish anyway? That's where the cooperatives would come in and value add and make tomato paste and make tomato sauce or whatever it is through value addition at the local level. So there's a lot of opportunities in the agriculture sector.
As we're just about to sample some of the feedback that we have, we invited you to share your thoughts and your questions with us. We're just about to sample them, but Honorable Kero, you had something to add?
Value addition, just to clarify one thing which is very important. You know, this is business at the end of the day. You need the key factor determinant here is the competitiveness of the products you produce. You can decide to value add on your tomatoes, on potatoes, on coffee, on tea, and everything. But at the end of the day, in the market out there, your pricing is based on the competitiveness, on the cost of production. If our cost of production is still high, this is why I keep going back to the government's policies, because they're the ones who control the energy pricing, the cost of power and all those things. They're the ones who determine the cost of freight and everything. You know, so a lot of things, the taxes, all those things impact on the cost. So if the cost of your product is, otherwise investors don't need to be enticed to come. If I am out there and I'm looking for opportunity to invest and I find I can manufacture coffee here, package it, brand it, and export, I will come. I don't even need to be. But when you find the cost is going to be too high, I can't compete out there in the market. I will not come. So I think there are a lot of factors, and all of them are based on things that are under the control of government. They can influence, and reduce that cost, whether it's tax or energy or all those things are things that the government can.
Yeah, interesting point there you raise, lowering the cost of production
that's
so
it.
that traders can have competitive prices in the international market.
That's it.
Interesting. And we just want to hear also what you had to say, your thoughts on the conversation we are having this morning as we just dissect the budget policy statement that was made public last Wednesday. And at Bob Otieno Owino, you say heavy taxation, mostly from many poor Kenyans, whose President William Ruto borrowed his slogans as hustlers, will hinder his first budget. And another mistake is to tax mobile transactions. We will go hard cash dealings. All right.
Engineer Lazaro says government should be keen not overburden urban dwellers by putting heavy taxes on landlords without proper guidelines. They would simply pass it to the tenants through rent adjustments.
Babu Michael 1, you say before the government tax more, there must be mechanisms to prevent looting of those taxes by state officials and other individuals. If that isn't done, then the taxes will just be a burden to the Kenyans, but no real development will be seen.
Godi Barasaware says President Ruto should ensure that his tax collection strategy will not oppress the small micro-entrepreneurs and the low class. He should focus on sealing all the loopholes of graft and enforce reasonable austerity measures.
And at Asawe, widening the tax base is crucial to ensure that the burden of taxation is shared fairly among all citizens and not just a few individuals. Let's work towards a more equitable tax system.
And we have Remy Butia says for taxation to work, citizens must trust their government. Tax system should be kept simple. Complex tax system foster a culture of evasion and can create opportunities for corruption.
And we have at Reverend Harry _Kosgei, you say, as a 2023-2024 budget policy, let the government focus on common commodities, not to increase tax. Thus, non-essential commodities meant for pleasure. It's okay. Let this be a friendly, affordable hustler budget to all Kenyans. Thank you, Reverend, for your feedback. So, yeah, there you have it. Kenyans seem to be really going heavy on the need to escalate the war against corruption. And I like also the one who said, let's make the tax system simple. Yeah, if you look at even filing your returns sometimes becomes quite a challenge for many Kenyans. I mean, things are just so difficult and complex. But thank you for your feedback. And we encourage, of course, more from you on the hashtag Daybreak at Citizen TV Kenya, at Safin _Cheng, and at Ayub Abdikadir, and at Citizen TV Kenya. Of course, we have some couple of minutes before we'll be running the tweets through that you will be sending over. And we thank you for your company and time here on the broadcast. Honorable Okero, a lot has been talked about here. The simplicity of the tax system. And because it's this administration that, according to them, bore the brunt of what they termed as state institutions that were unleashed on them, including the Kenya Revenue Authority. And when it investigated the former Madira MP, now Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, his bank accounts, and there was also a tweet on the linking of the taxing system to the telcos. Where is the place of privacy and personal data on this?
Yeah, I think it would be wrong and totally misplaced if this government attempts to integrate the KRA system with telephones or the bank accounts of individual Kenyans in order to look for money, because then it's going to be abused. And this government, when they were campaigning, have been subjected to that abuse more than any other, and they know what it means if KRA decides to abuse those powers. So because all transactions are not necessarily sources of income, and so I think the attempt to try and use every means possible to raise money would be wrong by the government. The second thing is that the issue of simplicity of tax is a major issue in this country. Our system of tax is the most complicated. You try to going through the Kenya Income Tax Act, even the experts, those tax advisors, they find it very difficult. And so the call has always been on, please make this tax simple. And because you want to collect money in many different ways, government has made our taxation very complicated. And you know, many of this, and they have introduced many different types of charges and levies. By any name, it is tax. That's why on petroleum, when you have 9 different types of levies and all those things, petroleum development, these are all, instead of putting money on and calling it tax, you call it a levy. This is what the government has been doing. Every year, they add 1 or 2 new levies onto their system, and all that money goes into the consolidated. It's part of the is tax. So, but I think simplicity of tax is important, particularly if you are targeting the SMS, the small and micro enterprises or the informal sector. You have to make it simple, because otherwise, to try and ask people to fill forms, you know, you have to hire an expert. Even if it's a nil return, it's a very complicated thing. So they have to simplify so that I can, if in the same way I can do my business on this, I want to be able to clear my tax. Other countries, it's the same. When you find people who are from Europe or America here, just sitting in a hotel and finishing their individuals, they're not experts. You know, they file their returns here without going to a lot of difficulties. I think we need to. Kenya, the problem is there's a trust deficit in this country. Institutions don't trust people. And people, we don't trust the institutions. Okay. And so things are made more difficult for you because KRA does not. When this self-assessment was started in 1992, returns are self-assessment returns. You're the one who determines how much tax you are paying. The idea was to make it easy for people so that you make your own assessment on your income and send it. They can, on random basis, then determine whether to do an audit of which income, whether you're in, then they can audit you and see whether what you have returned, what you have indicated in your returns are actually what your income was. But, you know, we have to simplify our tax system. It's very complicated and it's very difficult for individuals to file returns.
Yeah, there's also that shift from what I would call analog to digital, you know, way of doing it. Many county governments are currently embracing that digital platform to, you know, for people to pay their fees and even the taxes and all that. Part of, you know, the objectives of this was to, you know, tame corruption, to tame loss of fund hapo katikati when people are paying, making these payments. Do you think this is a step in the right direction? Is it working? Or it's making it even more complex for the common one?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I think we've mentioned before there are a lot of Kenyans pay taxes. Also, we have a lot of Kenyans also who don't pay taxes. And I think the encouragement is actually as Kenyans, let's all pay taxes, especially those who have ability to pay the taxes. But also just the tax leakages, the amount of money that is paid that never makes it to the exchequer is a lot. And I think digitization is one of those strategies that can help. Paying all the fees through eCitizen or through eTeams, for example, or through USDs when you're paying your parking and everything else. So a lot of the fees that is collected has made it into private pockets. I think we all hear about individuals in whether it's treasury or county governments, treasury officers who are very, very wealthy, but they've just amassed their wealth through corruption. So I think for me, digitization of the revenue collection is a good way. But also corruption is always ahead of strategies to curb corruption. So I think the government has to really continue to pursue ways to make sure that we net that taxation. But again, I think as Bill Kero has said so many times, we can't tax ourselves into prosperity. So we can rename and invent and come up with other levies. You look at just your electricity bill once you buy those tokens, just look at the amount of taxes that
it's a long list.
It's a long list, actually. And then you realize that you just buy units of like 30% of or 40% of the money that you've sent. So we are actually overtaxed, especially when you look at the basic commodities, energy. It's very, very expensive to do that. And we can't overtax ourselves into prosperity. So I think as the government tries to see how they finance their budget, taxation is one way, and simplification of taxation would be a good way. But let's also place a lot of emphasis on the leakages, on the corruption. And I think if there is any improvement that can be made on this budget policy statement, is really tackling the corruption issue. Yes, corruption may have been politicized and weaponized, or fighting corruption may have been politicized in the past regime, but that's no good reason, therefore, to do a 180-degree turn and move away from fighting corruption. We still need to continue fighting corruption. People who evade taxation must be made to pay those taxes due to the government. So dealing with the downstream losses is a good thing, and digitization is one of those tools.
Dr. When you talk about digitization, and you all acknowledge, you below and other economists, of the need for the other batch of Kenyans to pay the taxes. Why aren't they paying the taxes? I mean, is the government then meeting the expectation in terms of service delivery? In terms of their welfare, education, healthcare, the state of infrastructure, is that in order? Because failure to do that then increases, or rather exacerbates, the trust deficit that the public has against the government. And while the situation the opposite then, if education is in order, there's proper infrastructure, there's a universal healthcare coverage, wouldn't that not encourage people to pay taxes?
It would encourage people to pay taxes. Tax is one of those things that I say, we must pay, everyone must pay, but no one wants to pay. And partly because of the lack of trust element in terms of where is my tax going? Why am I paying these taxes? What is it being used to? So prudent use of government of the taxes that taxpayers pay would encourage many people to pay taxes. But the world over, I think taxes is one of those things that governments have had to make people pay. The US, they say God and tax, sure thing. So the enablement of everyone to pay taxes, especially roping in those of us who make a lot of money in the informal sector, but then do nil returns, I think is an injustice to society. I think as a society, we should look at it as unethical to make a lot of income and not pay taxes. Just because you have an opportunity not to pay taxes should really be an immoral thing. It's a good citizenship to pay taxes. So we should encourage Kenyans to pay taxes that are due to the government. Also, we should encourage governments to get a proper way that's not very invasive, not very regressive, not really looking at the low-hanging fruits from Mama Mbogas and everyone else, but that really to rope in the people who make income in this country to pay taxes in this country.
Mheshimiwa, how do we then tame our expenditure, our appetite for spending in the wrong areas, like we've all discussed this morning? Going forward, what would be the ideal way of addressing this?
In principle, taxes are collected to finance government activities. If there was no government, or there's no activity by the government, I will not pay any tax, because then there's no reason to pay it. And so that correlation is there. If government is providing services, I'll be happy to pay tax. That's why in countries like parts of Europe, Scandinavia or others, where the taxes are up almost 50%, very high, people get services. When you're unemployed, you get money. When you are sick, you get free treatment. Your students get free education. You see the services that the government provides. So you can relate your tax to services you get from government. But when you don't see it, I live in this country, I pay tax, I'm struggling to get power, my power disappears 3 hours, 4 hours a day. School fees, I have to struggle. My kids are not getting good education in a public school. Medical services, I struggle, I can't get anything. There are no medicines, I have to struggle to go to private. So, but these things are not, so people tend to then don't see why they have to pay these taxes. I think government needs to provide services. These things are correlated, it's very important. Now, the expenditure, I think going forward, there are good people, by the way, who should understand this thing, and I know they do. I mean, I have a lot of respect for some of the people who have been taken on board, like people like David Ndi, who was a friend of mine who has been insisting that Uhuru's administration, their expenditures were misplaced because they were focusing on infrastructure and big infrastructure and so forth, which did not have return that was benefiting. So people, Professor Ndungu is also very well focused on so. But at the end of the day, budgets are political instruments. They're political instruments, and there are a lot of other political expediencies that come in. I would have thought that if you look at the infrastructure in this budget policy, is nearly 400 billion, more or less similar to what it was the previous year. Okay. Plus minus a few, 4 or 5 billion. But I would have thought that with the focus on the bottom and the informal sector and the micro businesses and that there will be less on that and more money would be spent on education, on health, and the people down there really on food and those things. But still, I think we have to be. I would urge this government to be very cautious on these expenses, because the risk is that we are going to borrow more. You have already said the loans will be at 12.5 in 2027, but I'm worried it's going to be worse. And the government will then be forced to tax more people, you know, and the tax will make the cost of living even more higher. So I think the government needs to rationalize expenditure. Rationalize expenditure at every opportunity, not this austerity, cups of teas and flowers. No, the government needs to reduce some of the expenditures so that they can, you know, make the cost of living cheaper. Because the more, where does the government get the money? It's from me and you. So the more expenses they have, the more I have to pay them. And so we don't have to. We don't have to. They can live within their means. If your revenues are 2 trillion, do a budget of 2 trillion. Why must you spend 4 trillion if you don't have it?
Okay.
And you say, bring the money.
And
unleash KRA on Kenyans.
Okay. And talking about borrowing, because the president has outlined bold steps which he said will help Kenya in ending what he termed more or less as the begging bowl culture. But I'm looking at the budget deficit hole already this financial year as per the budget policy statement, Dr. Kitui, and that is over 600 billion Kenyan shillings. 198, according to the budget policy statement, will be financed through the borrowing of money externally, so that will be borrowing. 496.6 billion Kenya shillings, which is equivalent to 3% of GDP, will be from the domestic market. Treasury projects to lower the levels of public debt as a share of GDP from the current 65.7 by October 2022 to 51% by 2026. I mean, how practical is it? Because again, in another line it says that President Ruto has been speaking about this, and that the accumulation of huge burden for taxpayers, which is debt, vowing to only borrow to fund development activities while growing local revenues to minimize the need to borrow externally. Where is the balance here? You want to increase the revenue to fund the operations of government, and then on the other hand, for development purposes, you have to borrow external, and he's only borrowing 198 thereabout billion Kenya shillings to fix the deficit.
I just want to begin from where Honorable Bill Kero has left. While we agree that the government has to spend on infrastructure, I think we've overborrowed to spend on infrastructure a lot, and sometimes the return on investment on some of those infrastructure has not been realized. And the SGR is one good example of that, and I think we want to extend it now, and we're going to finance that through debt. It's not sustainable as well. You and I, we budget with the money we have. So once you're paid your salary, you sit down and you draw your budget and say, I'll spend on this and this and this. On the contrary, the government develops a budget and then figures out now, where do I get the money from that as well? So I think for me, from a public health prudence perspective, the government should just aim to live within its means. And that would be a good start in the first place. But it's because we're looking at a really bleak future if we keep on borrowing. We look at the Kenya shilling now, the depreciation of the Kenya shilling is massive. We're already spending a very huge proportion of our tax to just service debt. And I know the budget statement says that we've now increased our concessional loans, so probably they're negotiable and everything else. But we've had very huge, costly commercial loans as a government that we've borrowed. And these ones will require us to dig deeper and deeper into our pockets to service that debt. Already, IMF has placed us at a high risk from a debt distress level.
Okay.
That should send signals to people who are developing these budgets, I would think, because even the international financial institutions are worried about our debt trajectory. So I think for me, continuing to borrow to finance even development itself is not probably very well advised because of the expensiveness of it. But also even just domestic borrowing. One of the things that has actually diverted away funds from investment is the government's domestic borrowing as well. And economists usually say that as the government borrows more domestically, that money is not then available to the private sector to borrow.
Thank you.
Do business and to create industry, and MSMEs are crowded out by government as well. So I think for me, the Treasury should really look at a development pathway that is not borrowing heavy or loan dependent, so that we can actually reduce our debts.
Thank you.
Dr. Kitui, just before we finalize this conversation, there's an interesting paper report that Oxfam has done. I'm curious to know whether it addresses some of the gaps that we all are talking about, and what recommendations you're proposing on how to seal those loopholes.
So the Oxfam report, the survival of the richest, really focused on more of the extreme inequality. So the Oxfam report showed that in the past, for the past 25 years, for once we've seen extreme wealth increase, as the same time poverty increase, and across the world, and in the data in Kenya as well indicated so. And I think we've talked at length about that the GDP growth of the country and the wealth of the country is not trickling down. And it's a myth that actually it trickles down. The wealth has gone to the wealthiest, the 1%, the 10%, the richest, but then the poorest have lost. Most of the jobs that were lost during COVID-19 did not come back. Most of the businesses used it as an opportunity to actually do layoffs that they would not have done during in good time. So the increasing inequality is one of the things that Oxfam report highlights, and I think for me it's one of those crises we need to be talking about. Our challenge is not necessarily GDP growth. Our challenge as a nation should be how do we reduce inequality? And why I say that is because the extreme inequality means there's many, many Kenyans who are going through a lot of misery and devastation in a country that GDP grew by 7.5%. That is completely unacceptable. And it's the role of government through social spending to ensure that those who have ability to pay, the people who've really benefited from the increase in energy prices, increase in food prices, from the economic activity that has led to 7.5%, should actually pay their due taxes. And through social spending, we should be able to cushion people who are affected by the ongoing drought, for example.
Right.
Yes, Honorable Okero, your final remarks.
Yeah, so I think the government in this document, the budget policy, they do draw the attention to the global challenges which will impact on the economy. For example, I agree, they mentioned about the debt distress that the country faces, but at the same time they do appreciate that there is tightening of liquidity globally. Accessing loans for itself is going to be difficult for them because of the pressures of inflation in many countries. And this is why in the 3.9 trillion they intend to borrow for the next 5 years, 2.9 is domestic. Only 1 trillion will be foreign. The second reason why they are concerned about foreign is because of the shilling, the depreciation of the shilling, which is getting worse. And they're also worried. They do appreciate they have up to 1 trillion shilling in contingent liabilities by state corporations. These are grantees the government has given to various state corporations, KQs and KPC and many companies. If any of those companies fail to pay, the government has to pay. So that is another 1 trillion exposure that they have. But I think generally, in my view, the government needs to be alive to the fact that the more spending, appetite by the government, the more the situation will get worse in the economy. And they need to really focus on how to turn around the economy fast.
Thank you.
Before focusing on taxation. This for me is the most fundamental thing.
Thank you so much.
All right, Honorable Bilo Kero there is a political economist, and we were also having a sit down with Dr. John Kitui, the country director, Oxfam International. Unfortunately, we couldn't link up with Mheshimiwa Kuria Kimani, Member of Parliament for Molo, who also chairs the Finance Committee, who was supposed to be joining us from Mombasa. But either way, we have had a fruitful discussion on the way forward on the priority areas by the Kenya Kwanza administration in the 2022-2023 budget and how sustainable it is in this particular broadcast. But the show continues, by the way. Willis is coming up next. And today is actually kind of a bit calm. He's going to be talking about the power of meditation in wellness. Yes, so quiet time. Tulia, keep quiet and just think, deep thought in how that can help.
I don't know how well Willis has been ever since Sunday, because he didn't respond to my calls. So I have a case to settle with him.
He has been meditating.
Meditating about the loss of the Emirates because Manchester United were beaten. So I had to pick up that topic with him. But unfortunately, he did not respond to my calls. I'll be with Willis in under a minute's time here. But many thanks for waking up with us here on Daybreak. Asante sana. We thank you for your company and feedback on the hashtag Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya, at Ayub Abdikadir, and at Safin_Achieng. We'll do this again on Friday by the grace of God. Good morning.